There is plenty to be excited about over this weekend's win for Kansas State.
You are Locked On Kansas State, your daily podcast on the Kansas State Wildcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, welcome on into Locked On Kansas State, your daily Kansas State Wildcats podcast. I'm your host, Christian Rao, and thank you so much for making Locked On Kansas State your first listen every single day. Happy Monday, and welcome back to my everydayers. I'm excited for this new week. We have a lot to talk about, but we have to get to the exciting part right away. Kansas State basketball had a great weekend on the men's side for sure. We're going to talk about the women's on tomorrow's bonus episode. We're going to come out with a bonus episode for tomorrow, so tune in for that. But we will have plenty for you to talk about today. Before we get started, though, Super Bowl 59, I'm sure you all know, is here. And there is nothing better to make every play more excited than when FanDuel's Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and you win. If you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. I'm sure everybody knows those Kansas City Chiefs going to the Super Bowl. All right, the Kansas State Wildcats defeat another ranked opponent in Manhattan, taking down number 23 West Virginia 73-60 over the weekend. And it was all Kansas State from the beginning of the game, and they held on at the very end, even though West Virginia started to come back a little bit. I think that was more of a passive approach by Jerome Tang in the second half to make sure they got that win, because it snaps a 6-game losing streak for the program, and they absolutely needed this one. They absolutely needed this win. Now, before we get all too excited and looking too far ahead and getting too excited about the entire situation, which we probably will, there's no doubt about that. We probably will, myself included, without question. I want to talk into some of the good, some of the bad, some of the question marks, some of the biggest concerns that we might have to continue to look forward to not only this season, but the seasons ahead that we saw in this game. There's a lot of things to break down in this one, but let's talk about the initial good thing. And it started right from the beginning in this game for Kansas State. Much like the game last weekend in Lawrence, Kansas State had problems in the first couple minutes. They were down 14-0 against Kansas last week. Flip side, this Saturday against West Virginia, they are on a 19-2 run. Kansas State this time stepped up and was amazing in the first 8 minutes of the basketball game. Had a 19-2 run, which included a 17-0 run for the Wildcats in this one. And really, it was a lead that just held on for the rest of the game. West Virginia couldn't get anything back after it was all said and done. The Wildcats wound up going into the first half, heading into the locker room, up 42-18. It was just a really good feeling. Now, they were outscored in the second half, but as I mentioned to start this show, they were outscored 42-31 in the second half, but I feel like it was a passive approach by Jerome Tang, making sure that you got the win. Now, there were some question marks about some possible turnovers, things like that. I wasn't a big fan of some of the ref calls. Some of them, they weren't aggressive when they should have been. And then when players were being too aggressive, it wasn't being called on both sides, might I add. But regardless, Kansas State gets the win. They move to 8-11 on the season, 2-6 in conference. And both those wins in the Big 12 are at home against ranked opponents. This one this past weekend over 23 West Virginia. And then at the time, their Big 12 opener, it was number 16 ranked Cincinnati. The biggest thing that I take from this one, Dug McDaniel has another game where he shows improvement. And I think we have to start having the conversation that maybe you think about building the team, or at least making sure he is a core piece for 2025 to 26 season, next season and beyond. At the beginning of this year in non-conference play, at the beginning of the Big 12 play, when they were having those tough stretches, right after the TCU game, heading into the Oklahoma State game the first time around, because we're about to play Oklahoma State again, which we are going to get into later on in the show. Dug McDaniel, if I would have said that we should keep him next season, I feel like I'd get a ton of negative comments in the YouTube description. And by the way, please leave a comment down below. Talk about the game. Let's talk some Kansas State. I'd love to hear your comments. And while you're there, click that subscribe button as well. We are very close to 600 subscribers. But Dug McDaniel takes another step forward in this one. He plays 32 minutes more than anybody else on the team on Saturday. 15 points. He has 6 assists, and he finished with 2 rebounds as well, 2 steals, and finished with 3 turnovers. Now, 2 of those turnovers did come in the second half, but really in the first half, he played amazing basketball, and that's exactly where he needed to play. Amazing basketball right off the jump. Kansas State has had a problem playing good basketball right off the bat. I feel like I've had this same narrative on this show where I continue to ask this team to give me 40 good minutes of basketball, and this might be the best that we have got so far this season. I'm not sure that I could say this is fully 40 good minutes because of how the second half ended a little bit. Again, I do think that it was a coaching decision with the exception of a couple turnovers. I don't think you can really point too much on the team. They were holding down a very big lead. You played different basketball then, but it's probably the closest that we've been. And I'm okay with that. And I'm very excited to know that that's where this team is at right now. The way they did it, though, is very interesting. And this is a new concept that Kansas State we have seen from the Wildcats so far this season. They went with a pretty short rotation from their bench in this one. They only played about 6 guys. They overall did play 9, but they really only had about a 6-man rotation. All 6 of them playing at least 28 minutes with their starting 5 of Gasson, Hawkins, Jones, both Jones, McDaniel, and Hassan all playing over 28 minutes. You had Ugana playing 10 minutes, Moby playing 7, and David Castillo only playing 7 minutes as well. I want to talk about David Castillo in just a minute, but what that short rotation did is it allowed multiple players, and in this case, 5 different Kansas State Wildcat players to reach double digits. And that is huge. That is huge for trying to be competitive in this Big 12 conference. This is one of the toughest conferences in all of college basketball, even on the down year, because they are really kind of having a down year this year. If you look at the standings, if you look at the rosters, if you look at bracketology predictions, there's a lot of people thinking only about 7 teams are going to make the March Madness tournament. And some of those on those 7 are going to be considered like first in or first out, possibly bubble teams. That's unheard of when you're talking about the Big 12 in a normal season. This year is a down year for the Big 12, but I'll even take a step back and say that it's more of a difference, and we saw it with college football as well. So this isn't a new thought process here, but the parity with NIL, transfer portal, all that stuff is really changing college football, and it shows that any year can be anyone's year. Any year can be any program's year, and I don't know if this is going to be the new norm for the Big 12. I think there are going to be better years moving ahead. But overall, this is a down year for the conference. But even if that's the case, for Kansas State to have multiple players to have double digits in points, Gasson had 14. Coleman Hawkins had 11. Max Jones had 12. We already mentioned Dug McDaniel had 15. And then CJ Jones off the bench had 10. The only player who started this game, and had 29 minutes was Brennan Hassan. He only had 6 points on the day. He was 2 for 7 from the 3-point line. He didn't really get going too much, but the plus side is we didn't really need him to do that, which is great, because when we have needed him in the past and he's shot like that, it's been dreadful and it's led to some of those losses. So maybe this is one of those, let's get one of the Hassan bad games out of the way and we can use him later down the stretch. Hopefully that's the case. That's how that works, right? Either way, the double-digit thing is huge because it gives the opportunity for the defenses to have a very difficult time to depend who's going to the guard. You can't double team anybody. You are more than just a one weapon team. And in this conference, you need to have multiple scorers, multiple shooters to be able to get this moving forward and win the basketball game. Dug McDaniel starting to shoot more. Love to see it. This is the same type of conversation. Jerome Tang talked about it in the post-game conference. He said that they saw something in the film with West Virginia, and he knew that Dug McDaniel had to score a little bit more, so he pushed him to be a scorer. And then he talked about also in the Cincinnati win, how he said he remembered that Dug and Coleman Hawkins both had really good games. So they're pushing to have that happen again. They were looking for any way to break that losing streak. Can you blame them? Absolutely not. But that's not the first time that Tang has said that in a presser this year about telling a certain player that they need him to stop caring as much about getting other players involved and shoot the ball more. Earlier in the season during non-conference play, he said the same exact thing about Coleman Hawkins. And right after he had that conversation or talked about it, Coleman Hawkins had a couple really good games where he had at least double digits and scored and was the leading scorer in most of those games after that conversation. So if that is anything to keep in mind, anything to be excited about, that means we're probably into for even more success and more progress from Dug McDaniel. And if that's the case, I think we have 13 games left, 14 games left. No, I think it's less than that. I think it's 12 games less on the Big 12 schedule. Even if we have 12 more games of seeing how much Dug McDaniel can progress from now until the end of the season, I think we're going to find our answer that we are going to want to keep him around and his coaching staff, the one who also wants to follow that Houston formula of, with the exception of people leaving for the draft or eligibility reasons, keeping your top 10 players and ensuring that they don't leave for the transfer portal. You're going to have to start with a guy like Dug McDaniel. I said I wanted to mention David Castillo. There's a couple other things I want to mention about this game as well. And then we got to dig into this fact that this losing streak is over, and how do we make sure that that doesn't change? We're going to talk about that next. All here on Locked On Kansas State. This message is from Intuit TurboTax. Taxes are waiting and wondering and worrying if you're going to get any money back, and then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now, Taxes is matching with TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while you get real-life updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find your every deduction possible and file the form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now this is Taxes. Get an expert now at TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. And welcome back to Locked On Kansas State, your daily Kansas State Wildcats podcast. Do me a favor, hit that subscribe button right below. If you're listening on audio form, do me a solid and rate 5 stars or download the show wherever you're listening. Really helps the algorithm, really helps push it out to more Kansas State fans and all that good stuff here. So thank you so much for that. We're talking Kansas State basketball. They're coming off a huge win. Dare I say it? I think it's a fair assessment. A huge win against number 23 West Virginia. Hey, I mentioned when we were talking kind of pregame previewing to this show last week, the biggest thing they had to do was stop Javon Small. He played 38 minutes in this game, scored 22 points. He was 7 for 16 from the field. He got to the free throw line 6 times, was 5 from 6. They didn't really stop him, but they stopped everybody else, and they were overall a way better shooting team. They stopped West Virginia to only shooting less than 37% from the field and only 19% from the three-point line. That's the huge portion right there. especially because Kansas State shot almost 50% from the field. It was 47.3% and shot over 35% from the three-point line. Dug McDaniel 1 for 3 from the three-point line in his 15 points. I'd like to see him step up more with his three-point shooting. He was close to a 40% three-point shooter last year. I don't even know if he's at 25% total on the season this year. The fact that we're getting him to shoot more, though, he was 5 for 13 from the field, is great. I want to see more shooting from him. Speaking of guards, though, David Castillo only played 7 minutes in this game. And I don't know if that's a bad thing or a good thing, right? Because we're talking about an 8-11 basketball program right now. Although we have 2 ranked wins at home against Cincinnati, against West Virginia. We didn't have a good non-conference schedule. We had some pretty tough conference losses already with TCU, Oklahoma State. That Baylor loss doesn't seem to be, I think it's going to turn out to wind up being a bad loss when it's all said and done because they're starting to fall down a cliff, it looks like. Hope I'm wrong for the sake of the loss and the sake of the conference. But not playing David Castillo, it could be a problem. And the reason I say that is because you have to pick a time. If you're going to shift all your focus on trying to win right now, which every fan wants to see that, regardless of status, regardless of where they're at, because there's still this glimmer of hope that if you can make a run and win the Big 12 tourney, you're going to play postseason basketball. This is a very tough conference, regardless of how down of a year this conference is having. That still seems almost out of reach. And I've seen it in the comments, folks. I know I keep saying that there's a possibility because there is, but I see it in the comments and y'all let me know that they're not making the NCAA tournament. I get it. I understand. And I'm with you. I do not think that's happening, but we have to mention the fact that there is still a chance. However, I'm on the other side a little bit, more on the other side of the fence, thinking that you have to give as much possible time to David Castillo as you possibly can to look forward to the future of this basketball program. We mentioned how you should keep Dug McDaniel, make sure that find a way to stick him around and maybe even build around him. The fact that he's turning into a pretty solid guard, he can turn into a big contributor. Coach Tang talks about how it's important to have a solid veteran guard in your program. It's almost like having a head coach on the court. He spoke that before in press conferences, especially when talking about Kansas Jayhawks players. That was what he was referring to. And they have great success. Obviously, I don't need to tell you that. The fact that you can get Dug McDaniel, David Castillo, hopefully you can get Brennan Hawson, players like that to stick around. By any means, I don't think David Castillo is going to walk away because he only played 7 minutes in the game. So don't take this the wrong way here. But the coaching staff, I would like to see them play David Castillo more, especially when you have big leads like this. And this is where I'm going to go just kind of push back on my own thought a little bit here and stick with me. But the reason why I think David Castillo didn't play more than 7 minutes in this game, although when he was playing, he did not perform very well. He was actually pretty much a negative in this game. He had 2 turnovers in those 7 minutes. It's probably some of the worst basketball we saw from David Castillo, although they had this really nice lead when he was playing. Kansas State was on a 6-game losing streak. We just saw this rotation that basically only played 6 players the entire game. They needed this win. Jerome Tang was going to play all of his stars in the case to make sure they get this win. And they used every single ounce they possibly could to make sure that happened. And at one point they had a huge lead and they still only won by 13, but they made sure it happened. So on any other night, I would push this narrative even more and say, why aren't we playing David Castillo more than 7 minutes in a season that is pretty much lost? But the fact that they absolutely just needed a win, where it starts to see that the energy has flipped in this program, and props to Jerome Tang. And I've gave him criticism on this show, and I've seen it in the comments, and I've seen it across message boards, and other shows across the Kansas State community, and you name it. Anywhere you think Kansas State, I've seen the criticism to Jerome Tang. But I think the props are due, and the credit is absolutely due to Jerome Tang to finding a way to make this team actually buy in. I think that buzzword that we heard during this non-conference earlier in the season about the buy-in of this team, it sounded very comical at first. Like, thought it was almost like a scapegoat. Like you didn't want to answer this question, or you didn't really have answers, or whatever the case may be. And we're talking about this NIL roster that we're bringing in, big money in the eyes of Kansas State, no doubt. And then you're talking about buy-in. You're not talking about performance. You're not talking about the fact that this team should be a deep run NCAA team and they're lucky to even make the NIT this year. You're talking about culture and you're talking about buy-in. I think after seeing the last couple games, even with the losses to Kansas, even with the loss to Baylor, once the conversation switched from buy-in to tinkering, we are so close to winning. And then finally seeing it on the court this weekend against West Virginia, a ranked opponent, where it all came together, where there was huge energy, I think I finally understand what he meant by buy-in. And I think this team finally has it. Is it too late? Probably. That's probably true. But that doesn't change the fact that we're probably in for some really fun basketball for the rest of the season. And we're probably in for a lot of interesting conversations for players like Dug McDaniel, Brennan Hawson, David Castillo. And we're not going to forget about players like David Gasson and Coleman Hawkins for their efforts. But I do think we have to shift our focus and talk about the future of this club. So the losing streak is over. How do we continue to keep winning? And it's going to be a tough schedule coming ahead. And there's one more home game before we hit the road one more time, or at least once again, I should say. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about Oklahoma State coming up and how we can keep the winning streak, turn it into a winning streak. How can we do that? We'll finish that up the show right here on Locked On Kansas State. Well, Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easier to get into the action with the live betting all game long. You can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. Chiefs and Eagles. It's going to be, an interesting Super Bowl for sure. I'm not going to lie, I was hoping for a different outcome just because I wanted to see some new teams in there. But we look like we are going to get a fun one. Patrick Mahomes taking on Jalen Hurts, Travis Kelce taking on Saquon Barkley. There's going to be lots of offensive weapons. The anytime touchdowns could be galore. This could be a really high-scoring game, or this one could be a slobber knocker. We'll see what happens. But regardless of the case, download the app and head to FanDuel.com to get started. And you can bet just $5 if you win. You can score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, the official partner of Super Bowl 59. And welcome on back to Locked On Kansas State, your daily Kansas State Wildcats podcast. Hey, for your second listen, check out Locked On Big 12 with Drake Toll. He's got you covered for everything across the Big 12 conference. And then, hey, while you're there as well, just as I mentioned, the Super Bowl 59 is coming up. Why don't you head on over and check out Locked On Eagles and Locked On Chiefs. They're going to be really just covering the Super Bowl over the next couple weeks, and they're going to have plenty of coverage to get you ready for the big game. Maybe you can get some thoughts of what you're going to play on FanDuel. Well, we talked about this game, I think, since we've been blue in the face, and I'm glad because I feel like we need this good feeling for this basketball team. I feel a little more energized after watching the game this weekend, and it was much needed because some of these losses so far this season have not been fun to watch. Have not, and I don't have to tell you that, but the TCU loss, although they played with some pretty good energy, losing that game was tough. It was a heartbreaker. Then when they went to Oklahoma State, I feel like that's where we were at the absolute bottom. I feel like the Oklahoma State game was the worst game of the year for Kansas State on the road in Stillwater. It was terrible. And now Oklahoma State comes in to Manhattan midweek on Wednesday. This is a huge game. Not because they're a ranked opponent, because they're not. Not because this win changes the fact that we'll become ranked, because we won't. It's nothing like that. But after having a huge win against West Virginia, the last time we had a huge win like this against Cincinnati, we played really good against TCU, but couldn't finish. Couldn't play 40 full minutes to finish the game. This is a prime opportunity for Jerome Tang, his coaching staff, and all the players on Kansas State that are going to play. Whether he decides to keep this type of rotation like he did with the 6-man rotation, basically, even if it decides that David Castillo doesn't play so many minutes, I would like that to not happen. But if that's his idea, this is a perfect time to continue to show that this program can play 40 full minutes of basketball and create a winning streak. There's only been a handful of 2-game winning streaks so far this season for the Wildcats. They had 2 to start the season off against New Orleans and Cleveland State. Then they had 2 against Mississippi Valley State and George Washington. And they had a 2-game winning streak against Longwood and AR Pine Bluff. That's it. They have not anything else. It's been a very rough road for the Wildcats. As great as I feel right now, I will be ready to blow it all up and talk about how this season is completely gone. And it is 100% time to focus on the future of this program if Kansas State loses to Oklahoma State on Wednesday. Like, I feel like this game of winning, like the fact that you have to win this game, it's a non-negotiable for this program. Like, you have to win this game. Because if you look at the rest of the schedule that you have, and like I said, don't get me wrong, it already seems like it's way out of reach. But right after this game against Oklahoma State, you head on the road against number 3 ranked Iowa State. For the record, West Virginia did beat that team, and you just beat West Virginia. Just want to put that out there. But then you're also on the road against Arizona State. You come back home to take on the Jayhawks at home and Arizona at home. Then you're back on the road to take on BYU and Utah. Tang said something in the presser that I did not even pay attention to. I didn't know this until he brought it up. I looked it up and verified it, and he was right. Kansas State is the only team in the Big 12 with 4 different occasions of back-to-back road games this season in conference. No other team in the Big 12 has to do that 4 times. There's a few of 3, but most of them have 2. So Kansas State has a very tough schedule in conference. We already knew that, just the fact of this conference is very good. But then you add the fact that they have multiple more back-to-backs. You still have 2 more of those coming up after Oklahoma State, and then later on when you head to BYU and Utah. There's still a chance, folks. Right now, all you're doing is building a better seed for the Big 12 tournament and hoping you can find lightning in a bottle in a tournament time. There's March Madness. We've seen it. We've seen upsets. We've seen crazy runs. Why can't it be a team like Kansas State? But like I said, if they don't win this game on Wednesday, I'm ready to blow it all up. I'm ready to just say it's time to move on and focus on the future. And that is the only primary goal from here on out. David Castillo should be in the starting lineup after that case if they can't beat Oklahoma State. The complete mind shift has to change. Has to. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the women's basketball team for a bonus episode. And then we're also going to start digging into that college football position grade talk. How are we going to get to 105? It's the biggest question on everybody's mind across the college football landscape. Now that the transfer portal is finally closed and the national championship is over and we're moving on to the next stage as we continue to get ready for spring ball, 105 is the magic number. We'll talk about how we can possibly get there, and we'll talk about our predictions and projections across the next couple weeks as we prepare for spring ball. And then obviously you'll be here to talk more basketball. We'll do that all here on this show. But until then, please like the video, please subscribe. And this has been Locked On Kansas State.